Students, let us resume our discussion from general syllogistic rules. In the last class, we had discussed up to 6th rule. So, today we will discuss the 7th rule. Now, the 7th rule says that in a valid syllogism, if both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative. As you know, in an affirmative proposition, there is a relation of inclusion between two terms. One term is included within the other term. The class designated by one term is included within the other class. If our middle term is affirmatively connected with major term and minor term, then there can only be affirmative relation between major term and minor term. So, here I have given one concrete example. All men are mortal, Ram is a man, therefore, Ram is mortal. So, this is the example. In this example, all three propositions are affirmative propositions. The first proposition is all men are mortal. Here, the class man is included within the class mortal. This is your major premise. Minor premise says Ram is a man. That means Ram is included within the class man. So, these two are affirmative premises. From these two affirmative premises, we draw the conclusion that is Ram is mortal. That means Ram is included within the mortal class. So, conclusion becomes affirmative in nature. So, here the outer circle stands for mortal class, the middle circle represents main class, and the inner circle it shows that Ram is mortal. Ram is included within the mortal class. So, if both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative. The converse of this rule also holds good. That means, if conclusion is affirmative, then both the premises must be affirmative. Now, we will move to the rule 8. Rule 8 says, in a categorical syllogism, if both the premises are particular, then no conclusion follows. As all of you know, there are 4 types of categorical propositions: A, E, I and O. A and E are universal propositions and I and O are particular propositions. Now, the rule says if both the propositions, both the premises are particular, then we will not get any conclusion. It will not yield any valid conclusion. So, I and O are particular propositions. Let us add I and O with I and again I and O with O, then we will get all the possible combinations: I, O, I and O. So, these are the 4 combinations in which the two premises are particular propositions. Now, I, the first premise is major premise, second premise is minor premise. You know, I proposition does not distribute any term. Here both the premises are I proposition. So, they do not distribute any term. And you have the third rule, middle term must be distributed at least once in the premises. If it is not distributed, then we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. So, In I and I combination, middle term will not be distributed. So, this will not give us any valid conclusion. Then we have O and O propositions. O and O, two are premises, both are negative premises, both are negative propositions. As you know, there is a rule that if both the premises are negative, no conclusion follows. So, O and O both are negative. From this combination also we will not get any result, we will not get any conclusion. This is invalid. Then there remains only two combinations. One is IO and the second one is OI. IO, I is the major premise, then O is the minor premise. Now, one of the premises is negative, O is negative. As O is negative, if one premise is negative, the conclusion must be negative. This is in your rule. Jodi gote premise negative hela, tahele conclusion nischinta negative habo. तेणु आई ओ कॉम्बिनेशन रे दीटा जदि प्रेमिस हेले ताहेले तार कंक्लूजन मध्य नेगेटिव हबो. देन आई प्रोपोजिशन डज नॉट डिस्ट्रीब्यूट एनी टर्म. ओ प्रोपोजिशन डिस्ट्रीब्यूट्स ओनली प्रेडिकेट. So, in this combination only one term is distributed and that term should be your middle term to avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle. Now, no other term gets distributed here. If one premise is negative, then the conclusion also will be negative. As you know, negative propositions always distribute their predicates. So, negative conclusion will also distribute the predicate. So, what is this predicate? This predicate is your major term. So, if major term is distributed in the conclusion, it should also be distributed in the major premise. But what is your major premise? Major premise is I. I does not distribute any term. So, major term is distributed in the conclusion, but undistributed in the premise. So, we commit the fallacy of illicit major. This combination IO also will not give us any valid conclusion. Now, let us see the next combination, that is your OI combination. O proposition is your major premise and I proposition is your minor premise. One premise is negative, O is negative. If O is negative, one premise is negative, then conclusion must be negative. In the premises O and I, O premise distributes the conclusion. I premise does not distribute any term. So, here in this combination only one term gets distributed. गोटिए term distribute ହେଇଛି କାରଣ O केवल गोटिए को distribute କରିଛି, I काहा को distribute करू नाही. तेणु जो गोटिए term सेठी distribute ହେଲା, that term should be your middle term to avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle. Now, if one premise is negative, the conclusion also must be negative. The conclusion, if it is a negative conclusion, then again it will distribute the predicate. So, what is the predicate? Predicate is your major term. If major term is distributed in the conclusion, then it should also be distributed in the major premise. But this is not distributed in the major premise. We commit the fallacy of illicit major. So, here these possible combinations do not give us any valid conclusion. So, if both the premises are particular, then no conclusion follows. दुईटा जाक प्रेमिस जदि पर्टिकुलर होउचंती ताहेले दुईटा पर्टिकुलर प्रेमिस रु कोनोसी कंक्लूजन फॉलो करिबो नाही. This is your rule 8. Then we will move to rule 9. Rule 9, ninth rule says that in a valid syllogism, if one of the premises is particular, then the conclusion must be particular. Previous rule रे तुम्हें जानिला जदि दुईटा जाक प्रेमिस पर्टिकुलर हेले ताहले कोनोसी कंक्लूजन आसीबो नाही. जदि गोटिए प्रेमिस पर्टिकुलर अछि that means the other premise must be universal proposition. So, you know A and E are universal propositions and I and O are particular propositions. Now, let us get the possible combinations here. We will add I and O with A, then again I and O with E. So, we will get A I, A O, E I and E O combinations. So, here let us see what will be our conclusions. आमर रूल कहूँ जदि गोटे प्रपोजिशन गोटे प्रेमिस तुमर पर्टिकुलर हुए ताहले कंक्लूजन मध्य पर्टिकुलर हेबो. नाउ E and O proposition, the last combination, there both are negative, and you have a rule, if both the premises are negative then no conclusion follows. Then let us go to the first combination, that is A and I propositions. A is major premise, I is minor premise. Now both are affirmative. You have a rule, if both the premises are affirmative, then the conclusion must be affirmative conclusion. Now, A proposition distributes only subject and I proposition does not distribute any term. तेणु A आउ I भितरे केवल गोटे टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हैला. A गोटे टर्म को डिस्ट्रीब्यूट कला. So, that means that term must be your middle term to avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle. तेणु A आउ I भितरे गोटे टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेछि सेटा हेबो तुमर मिडिल टर्म, ता छड़ा आउ कोनोसी टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेई नाही. सो तुमे एमिति कंक्लूजन नब जो थिरे कि कोनोसी टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हबो नाही. तेणु आमर कंक्लूजन कौन हबो? आमर कंक्लूजन अफर्मेटिव हबो. अफर्मेटिव मीन्स A और I. A proposition डिस्ट्रीब्यूट सब्जेक्ट, I does not distribute any term. तेणु को प्रपोजिशन आमर कंक्लूजन हबो? A डेफिनेटली हबनी, कारण A रे गोटे टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट होउछि. I प्रपोजिशन काहाको डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करू नाही. तेणु I proposition will be your conclusion. So, here one premise is particular. So, conclusion also becomes a particular conclusion. Now, the next combination, that is your A-O combination. A is major premise, O is minor premise. O is negative, so conclusion will be negative. If one premise is negative, conclusion must be negative. Then A proposition, you know, it distributes the subject and O proposition distributes the predicate. तेणु ए कॉम्बिनेशन रे आमर केवल दुईटा टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हैला आउ दुईटा भितरु गोटे निश्चिंत भाव में आमर मिडिल टर्म हम नहले आमर फालासी ऑफ अनडिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड मिडिल हो जिवो. तेणु गोटे हैला मिडिल टर्म आउ रहिला गोटे टर्म. तेणु कंक्लूजन शुड बी सच दैट इट शुड डिस्ट्रीब्यूट ओनली वन टर्म. गोटे टर्म को डिस्ट्रीब्यूट करिवो. कंक्लूजन इज नेगेटिव. So, which negative proposition you will take such that that will distribute only one term? को negative proposition को तमे नबो e को नबो ना o को नबो जदि e को नबो ताहले दुईटा टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हबो जदि o को नबो ताहले गोटिए टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हबो तेणु आमे ओ नबा जेहेतु गोटिए टर्म बळी से गोटिए टर्म ही हमर डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेई परिबो कंक्लूजन रे सो o proposition will be our conclusion. O is particular negative. So, here also you see one premise is particular, that means O is particular. So, conclusion also is a particular conclusion. Now, we will see the next combination, that is your E-I combination. E proposition means universal negative proposition. One is negative proposition, the other is affirmative proposition. If one premise is negative, then the conclusion must be negative according to our rule. Now, E proposition distributes both subject and predicate, and I proposition does not distribute any term. तेणु दुईटा प्रेमिस रे टोटाली केतटा टर्म तुमरा डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन हेले डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड हेले दुईटा टर्म बिकॉज ई डिस्ट्रीब्यूट सब्जेक्ट एंड प्रेडिकेट तेणु ई प्रपोजिशन रे हमर दुईटा टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेला दुईटा टर्म भितर गोटे हवा निश्चिंत भाव रे हमर मिडिल टर्म टू अवॉइड द फलासी ऑफ अनडिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड मिडिल so there remained only one extra term गोटे एक्स्ट्रा टर्म रहिला तेणु आमे एमिति भावरे कंक्लूजन को नबा जोथरे केवल से गोटे टर्म ही डिस्ट्रीब्यूट होथिबो आवर कंक्लूजन इज नेगेटिव तो व्हिच नेगेटिव प्रपोजिशन विल बी आवर कंक्लूजन ई और ओ ई रे दुईटा टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हबो ओ रे गोटे टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हबो सो ई कैन नॉट बी आवर कंक्लूजन सो O will be our conclusion. So, conclusion will be a particular conclusion. Premise is particular I, one premise is particular. So, conclusion also is a particular conclusion. So, if one of the premises is particular, then the conclusion must be particular. The converse of this rule also holds good. If conclusion is particular, then one of the premises must be particular. That means जदि conclusion टा particular हैला सेठु तुमे जानिबो जे गोटे premise होची particular आ गोटे premise होची universal. Okay? So, this is all about the 9th rule. Now, the 10th rule. 10th rule says that in a syllogism, if major premise is particular, minor premise is negative, then no conclusion follows. Here minor premise is negative. You know, both the premises cannot be negative according to the general syllogistic rule. Both the premises cannot be negative. So, if one is negative, then the other must be affirmative. जदि हमर minor premise negative हैला ताहेले major premise टा निश्चिंत भावरे हमर affirmative हबो आगरु हमर दिया जाइछे जे major premise is a particular proposition. So, major premise is particular affirmative. That means major premise is I proposition. So, here you see major premise is I proposition, minor premise is negative proposition. As you know, if one premise is negative, conclusion must be negative. जदि गोटे premise negative हैला conclusion निश्चिंत भावरे negative हबो. And negative propositions always distribute their predicates. So, negative conclusion will distribute the predicate. What is this predicate? This is your major term. Predicate of the conclusion is known as major term. So, major term will be distributed in a negative conclusion. Okay? Now, if major term is distributed in the conclusion, it should also be distributed in the major premise. मेजर प्रेमिस रे मध्य डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हवा दरकार जदि कंक्लूजन रे डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेछि ताहेले मेजर प्रेमिस रे मध्य एटा डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हवा दरकार मेजर प्रेमिस रे हेछि कि डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड नो बिकॉज मेजर प्रेमिस इज आई प्रोपोजिशन आई डज नॉट डिस्ट्रीब्यूट एनी टर्म तेणु आई रे कोनोसी टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेई नाही तेणु मेजर टर्म मध्य डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेई नाही सो वी विल कमिट the fallacy of illicit measure. Now, we discussed all the 10 general syllogistic rules. Now, we will apply these 10 general syllogistic rules to know which moods are valid and which moods are invalid. You know, in the wide sense, we have 16 moods. We have 16 moods, but all these moods are not valid. Some are valid, some are invalid. Now, let us see which combinations yield us valid conclusion, give us valid conclusion. You have one rule that if both the premises are negative, then no conclusion will follow. Here in these 16 moods, there are 4 combinations in which both the premises are negative. So, there we will not get any conclusion. EE, EO, OE and OO. এই চারিটারে आमर दुईटा जाक प्रेमिस अच्छी नेगेटिव तेणु कौन सी कनक्लूजन आसीबो नाही देन अगेन यू हैव अनदर रूल दैट इफ बोथ द प्रेमिसेस आर पर्टिकुलर देन आल्सो नो कनक्लूजन फॉलोज सो हियर यू सी आई ओ ओ आई these combinations also do not give us any valid conclusion because here both the premises are particular. Then the 10th rule is there. According to the 10th rule, if major premise is particular, minor premise is negative, no conclusion follows. And here we have the combination I-E. This combination also does not give us any conclusion. Now, there remained only 8 moods AA, AE, AI, AO, EA, EI, IA and OA. ये जो 8 कॉम्बिनेशंस रहिला ताको आमे आमर 4टा फिगर अच्छे प्रति फिगर ए 8टा कॉम्बिनेशन रो आमे देखिबा को कॉम्बिनेशन कोटा आमर वैलिड होची कोटा वैलिड सिलोजिज्म हबो कोटा इनवैलिड हबो सेटा को आमे डिटरमिन वर्तमान करिबा. Now, the first figure. So, as you know, in the first figure, middle term is subject in the major premise and predicate in the minor premise. The first combination is A. Here, both the premises are affirmative. So, conclusion is also affirmative conclusion. Both are universal. So, conclusion may be universal, may be particular. आउ गोटे जिनस तुम जो डिटरमिन कर वैलिड मोड्स से देखिबो जे मिडिल टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट होइछि ना नहीं. मिडिल टर्म शुड बी डिस्ट्रीब्यूटेड एटलिस्ट वन्स इन द प्रेमिसेस. गोटे थर मध्य मिडिल टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हवा दरकार. तापर देखिबो कंक्लूजन रे को टर्मटा डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेछि जदि से टर्मटा कंक्लूजन रे डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेछि ताहले प्रेमिस रे मध्य सेटा डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हबा दरकार न हेले इनवैलिड हे जिवो। वर्तमान आमे देखिबा फ्रॉम ए वी गेट ए कंक्लूजन। So conclusion is A. A conclusion distributes subject. So subject is your minor term. Minor term is distributed in the conclusion. So in the premises we have to see whether minor term is distributed or not and whether middle term is distributed or not. A proposition major premise distributes a subject, that is your middle term, then minor premise A distributes subject, that is your minor term. So both minor and middle terms have been distributed in this combination. So this is a valid mode. This is according to the rules, and this mode is technically known as Barbara. Now we will discuss AE. AE combination. Here E is negative. If one premise is negative, then the conclusion also must be negative. So we will get a negative conclusion. Then A and E both are universal. If both are universal, then the conclusion may be universal, may be particular. So we have taken a universal conclusion, E proposition, universal negative proposition. So E proposition, you know, it distributes both subject and predicate. That means minor term and also major term. So in the conclusion, two terms are distributed. And in the premises, how many terms are to be distributed? Ketara term distribute habo? In the premises, we have to distribute. We have to see that three terms are distributed: major term, minor term and also middle term. A proposition distributes middle term and E proposition minor premise distributes minor term and middle term, but here major term is not distributed. In the conclusion, major is distributed, major term is P, but major term is undistributed in the major premise. So we commit the fallacy of illicit major. This is invalid. Then the next combination we will see A and I propositions. Now A and I both are affirmative. दीटा जाक affirmative. दीटा जाक affirmative जदि ताहले conclusion मध्य affirmative होबो. Again one premise is particular. If one premise is particular, conclusion also will be particular. तेणु conclusion आमर कौन हबो? Particular affirmative proposition. Particular affirmative means I proposition. I proposition does not distribute any term. कहा को distribute करू नाही. तेणु आमर प्रेमिस रे को टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हबा दरकार? केवल मिडिल टर्म. जदि मिडिल टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेइथिबो, देन इट विल बी ए वैलिड मोड. देखिबा वर्तमान ए हैला तुमर मेजर प्रेमिस डिस्ट्रीब्यूट्स मिडिल टर्म. सो दिस इज ए वैलिड मोड and this is known as Dari I. Then we will move to the next combination, that is your A-O combination. Here one premise is negative. If one premise is negative, the conclusion must also be negative. Then O is particular. According to the rule, if one premise is particular, conclusion also will be particular. So conclusion will be your O proposition, particular negative. Particular negative proposition, that means O proposition, distributes predicate. Predicate means major term. So, major term is distributed in the conclusion. So, in the premises, how many terms should be distributed? Only two terms should be distributed. One is major term, another is your middle term, to avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle. Now, let us see whether two terms have been distributed or not. A proposition major premise distributes M middle term, but it does not distribute the major term. It does not distribute the major term. So, here we commit the fallacy of illicit major. This is an invalid mode, because major term is distributed in the conclusion, but undistributed in the major premise. Now, the next combination is EA. Now, E is negative, so conclusion must also be negative. Both are universal, conclusion may be universal, may be particular. So, here we have taken universal proposition, universal negative proposition or E proposition as the conclusion. So, E proposition is our conclusion. So, which terms are distributed in E proposition? E distributes both subject and predicate. Subject and predicate means minor term and major term. So, both are distributed in E proposition. ତେଣୁ ରେ ଦୁଇଟା ଯାକ ଟର୍ମ ଡିଷ୍ଟ୍ରିବ୍ୟୁଟ୍ ହେଇଛି. So, how many terms should be distributed in the premises? 3 terms, minor, major and middle. So, let us see what happens. Now, E proposition distributes middle term and major term. A proposition distributes minor term. So, all three have been distributed. So, this is a valid mode and this is known as Syllogistic. Now, we will move to the next combination, that is EI. E proposition. E distributes both subject and predicate. Then E is your negative proposition. So, conclusion must be negative. I is particular proposition, conclusion must be particular. So, conclusion is O proposition. Now, O proposition is the conclusion. O distributes the predicate term, that means the major term. So, in the premises, two terms should be distributed. So, what are the two terms? Major term and middle term. Now, let us see whether these two terms are distributed in the premises or not. E distributes both subject and predicate, that means middle term and your major term. So, both the terms are distributed in E proposition. So, E and I is a valid combination, it is a valid syllogism and the technical name is Ferio. Now, let us move to the IA combination. Here both are affirmative, conclusion must be affirmative. I is particular, conclusion also is particular. So, conclusion is I proposition, particular, affirmative. I proposition does not distribute any term. तेणु आमे देखिबा केवल मिडिल टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेछि ना नाही. Here middle I proposition is the major premise and here it does not distribute the middle term. A proposition also does not distribute the middle term. A distributes subject term, not the predicate term. So, this is invalid because here we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. Next is OA combination. O, this is negative, so conclusion is negative. O is particular, conclusion must be particular. So, conclusion will be an O proposition and O proposition distributes the predicate term. Predicate means this is your major term. So, in the premises, two terms should be distributed. One is major term, the second one is middle term. Here you see O proposition is the major premise, it distributes the major term, and A proposition distributes minor term, that is S. So, middle term is not distributed here. Here we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. So, this is not a this is not a valid syllogism. This is invalid syllogism. So, here in the first figure we have 4 valid modes: Barbara, Celarent, Dariai and Ferio. ये टेक्निकल नेम्स गुड़ा तुमको मन रखा पड़ो, कारण पर जो रिडक्शन कर एगुड़ा बहुत इम्पोर्टेंट. So, Barbara, Celarent, Dariai, Ferio, these are the 4 valid modes of the first figure. Now, we will move to the second figure. से 8टा मोड जो रही से 8टा मोड रू आम सेकेंड फिगर पुणी डिटरमिन करवा कोटा वैलिड कोटा इनवैलिड. In the second figure, how do you recognize the second figure? By seeing the position of middle term. Here middle term is predicate in both the premises. Now, A combination, both are affirmative, conclusion is affirmative. Both are universal, conclusion may be universal, may be particular. So, we have taken A conclusion here. A proposition distributes subject. So, here minor term is distributed, minor S is your minor term is distributed. So, in the premises minor term should be distributed and middle also should be distributed. Here in the premises middle term is not distributed. So, we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle and this is invalid argument. Now, next one is AE. E proposition is negative. If it is negative, conclusion must also be negative. Now, conclusion is E proposition. E proposition distributes subject and predicate, two terms. That means minor term and major term. दुईटा term distribute हेची आमर conclusion रे. तेणु premise रे केतेटा term distribute हबो? एई दुईटा plus middle term तीनिटा term distribute हबा दरकार. Major premise रे major term distribute हेची, minor premise रे minor distribute हेची, आउ middle मध्य distribute हेची. So, this is a valid mode and this is known as seamstress. Now, the next combination is AI. A and I both are affirmative propositions. So, the conclusion also will be an affirmative conclusion. Then I is particular. So, conclusion also will be a particular conclusion. So, conclusion will be your I proposition. And as you know, I proposition does not distribute any term. कौनसी term distribute करे नहीं. So, only one thing we should see, whether middle is distributed in the premises or not. But here middle term is not distributed in the premises. So, this is an invalid argument and we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. Now, next combination is AO. O proposition is negative. So, conclusion also will be negative. O is particular, conclusion also will be particular. So, conclusion will be O proposition. O proposition always distributes the predicate. So, predicate is distributed here, that means major term is distributed here. So, in the premises major term should be distributed, and together with that the middle term should also be distributed to avoid the fallacy of undistributed middle. Let us see what has happened here. So, here major term is distributed, major premise distributes P major term, and O this distributes M. So, this distributes the middle term. So, middle term is distributed and major term also is distributed. So, this is a valid argument and this is known as Barocco. Now, we will move to the next one, that is our EA combination. E proposition, this is our negative proposition. So, conclusion will be negative. Yadi negative, if one premise is negative, then conclusion must be negative. So, we should take one negative conclusion. E and A both are universal propositions. So, conclusion may be universal, may be particular. So, here we have taken a universal negative proposition as the conclusion. So, E is our conclusion, and you know E proposition distributes both subject and predicate. That means, both the terms minor term and major terms they get distributed in the conclusion. So, in the premises we have to see that whether three terms have been distributed or not, major term, minor term and also the middle term. Here major term is distributed in the major premise and middle term also is distributed in the major premise, and in the minor premise minor term also gets distributed. So, all three have been distributed. So, this is a valid mode. This is according to the rules, and this valid mode is known as Cesare. Then the next one is EI. E proposition is negative. So, conclusion is negative. I proposition is particular, conclusion is particular. So, conclusion is particular negative, that is your O proposition. And O proposition, you know, it distributes the predicate term. Predicate means major term. So, major term gets distributed in the conclusion. In the premises, therefore, two terms should be distributed. One is your major term, the other is your middle term. So, let us see what has happened here. Major premise is E, E distributes major term and middle term. So, this is your valid mode, this is a valid argument, and this is known as Festino. Now, we will move to the seventh one. Seventh combination is IA. Here I proposition, I premise and A premise both are affirmative propositions. If both are affirmative, conclusion must be affirmative. This is your rule. Then I is particular, then conclusion must be particular. These are all your general syllogistic rules. I am just applying the rules. If one premise is particular, conclusion is particular, then conclusion becomes your I proposition, particular affirmative. If both the premises are affirmative, conclusion also is affirmative. So, conclusion is particular affirmative I proposition. Now, you know I proposition does not distribute any term, कौनसी term एठी distribute हो नाही, तेणु केतेटा term हमर premise रे distribute हबा दरकार. We need to distribute only one term, that is your middle term. Let us see. Here I proposition does not distribute any term, A proposition distributes the minor term. So, middle term is not distributed in the premises. Therefore, we commit the fallacy of undistributed middle. Then the next combination, the last combination of the second figure, OA. O is particular negative. So, conclusion must be particular negative O proposition. So, O proposition distributes the predicate term. Predicate means your major term. Major term is distributed in the conclusion. So, in the premises major term should be distributed and middle term also should be distributed. So, in OA, O distributes middle term, but does not distribute the major term. So, major term is distributed in the conclusion, but undistributed in the major premise. So, this is an invalid argument, because here we commit the fallacy of illicit measure. Now, what are the valid modes of the second figure? The valid modes of the second figure are Caesare, Semestris, Festino and Barocco. Caesare, Semestris, Festino, Barocco. Okay. Now, let us move to the third figure. Third figure, what is the position of middle term in the third figure? Middle term is subject in both the premises. Then first is AA, both are universal propositions, both are affirmative propositions. So, conclusion will be affirmative and conclusion may be universal, may be particular. But from AA we cannot draw any conclusion, because if the conclusion will be an A proposition, it will distribute the subject, that means the minor term will be distributed, but minor term is undistributed in the minor premise. So, A cannot be your conclusion, I can be your conclusion. I does not distribute any term. So, we need to see that if only one term, that is middle term, is distributed in the premises or not. So, here you see middle term is distributed in the premises, middle term distribute heichi. So, this is a valid mode and this is known as Darapti. And AE, here also one premise is negative and the conclusion must also be negative conclusion. Both are negative, conclusion will be negative conclusion, sorry, both are universal, the conclusion will be universal proposition. So, the conclusion is E proposition. E distributes both subject and predicate. तेणु आमर प्रेमिस रे आमे देखिबा तीनिटा टर्म डिस्ट्रीब्यूट हेछि ना नाही, मेजर टर्म, माइनर टर्म एंड मिडिल टर्म, but major term is undistributed in the argument. So, here we commit the fallacy of illicit measure. This is not a valid argument. Now, we will discuss the next mode, that is your AI. Here both are affirmative, duita jaka affirmative. So, conclusion will be affirmative and one premise is particular, conclusion also is particular. I does not distribute any term. So, आमे देखिबा केवल middle term distribute हेछि ना नाही. Middle term is distributed here. So, this is a valid mode and this is known as dirty C. Then another valid mode we will discuss, that is your EA. In EA, E is your negative proposition and the conclusion also will be a negative conclusion. Now, conclusion is O proposition. O distributes the predicate term and predicate is your major term. So, in the premises major term should be distributed and the middle term should also be distributed. Here middle term is distributed and major term also has been distributed. So, this is a valid mode and this is known as phylapton. एई भाबरे तुमे थर्ड फिगर रे सब वैलिड मोड्स डिटरमिन करिवो मु जेमती तुमको कहिली तापरे तुमे जेतेबेले डिटरमिन करि सारिवो देखिबो जे कोन कोन वैलिड मोड्स अछि. So there we have 6 valid modes: Darapti, Dirty C, Disamiss, Phelapton, Ferrician and Boccado. So, there are 6 valid modes. Now, we will move to the fourth figure. In the fourth figure, what is the position of middle term? Middle term is predicate in the major premise and subject in the minor premise. Now, we will see the combination, that is A. A is valid or not. Now, both are affirmative. So, conclusion also is affirmative. We have I proposition as the conclusion. I proposition does not distribute any term. So, here the middle term is distributed in the premise. So, this is a valid mode. This is known as Brahmantip, and we will see the next combination, that is AE. So, E proposition is negative, conclusion is negative, and both are universal. Conclusion also is universal. Now, here we get the E proposition as the conclusion. E distributes both subject and predicate. So, minor term and major term both are distributed here. In the premises, we have to distribute 3 terms: minor, major and middle. देख वर्तमान हेछि ना नहीं तीनटा जाक डिस्ट्रीब्यूट. ए प्रपोजिशन रे मेजर टर्म हेछि एंड ई प्रपोजिशन रे माइनर टर्म हेछि आ मिडिल टर्म मध्य हेछि. सो दिस इज ए वैलिड मोड. दिस इज नोन एज कैमेनेस. सो एमिति भाबरे तुमे सबु डिटरमिन करिवो वैलिड मोड्स फोर्थ फिगर रो सबु गुडा देखिला परे तुमे पाइबो जे फोर्थ फिगर रे तुमरो अछि Brahmantip, Camenes, Dimaris, Fesapo and Fresition. So, in this way we determine the valid modes of all the 4 figures. In the first figure you have the valid modes Barbara, Celarent, Darii and Ferio. In the second figure we have the valid modes Cesare, Semestris, Festino, Barocco. In the third figure we have Darapti, Disamis, Dotisi, Phelapton, Ferrician and Boccado, and fourth figure we have Brahmantip, Camenes, Dimaris, Fesapo and Fresition. So, these are the valid modes of 4 figures. तमे ए जो वैलिड मोड्स गुड़ा है से गुड़ा सब मन रखा पड़ो कारण पर तुमर अच्छे रिडक्शन. यू हैव टू डू रिडक्शन. डायरेक्ट रिडक्शन इज देयर, इनडायरेक्ट रिडक्शन इज देयर. सो you have to memorize all these valid modes. So, students, today we have completed your unit 1, and in unit 1 you know we have completed conversion, aversion, then syllogism, figure of syllogism, structure of syllogism, 10 general syllogistic rules and determination of the valid modes. So, your unit is over. Thank you.